She means well, Roland. She just doesn't understand how any of this works. She never has. Mom's always been more of a background person. I heard it through the study door. My son's voice, warm and easy the way it got when he was performing for someone he wanted to impress. A laugh underneath it. Not mean, which almost made it worse. Dismissive the way you dismiss something you have genuinely never considered a threat. A background person. My name is Constance Albright. I am 71 years old, and for 35 years, I kept the books for 46 small businesses in this county, and not one of them ever lost a dollar they shouldn't have lost on my watch. But let me go back. Let me go back to before, when the house was still the shape it was supposed to be, and I still believed certain things about my son that turned out to be half true at best. I have lived in this house since 1981. It is a tall, narrow Victorian on Clement Street, with a porch that wraps around two sides and crown molding in the front rooms that my late husband Warren spent 3 weekends restoring with a patience I found beautiful to watch. Warren was an engineer by training and a craftsman by nature. He approached everything, including the raising of our son, with methodical care and genuine love. Nate was born in 1978. He came out of the womb certain of himself in a way that made the nurses laugh and made Warren and me exchange a glance that said, "This one is going to require something extra from us." He was bright and funny and relentlessly social, the kind of boy who was liked by everyone and therefore never had to develop the quieter qualities that get built in children who have to work harder to be seen. We loved him extravagantly. I say that not as excuse, but as context. Warren died 4 years ago. A long illness, a hard ending, the kind that takes something out of the survivor that doesn't fully grow back. Nate came home for the final weeks, and he was good during that time. Genuinely good. He sat with his father and held his hand, and I revised some of my private worries about who he had become. After Warren died, he called every Sunday for a year, then every other Sunday, then when he remembered. I had my routines, my Tuesday morning coffee with my friend Lorraine, my Thursday volunteer work at the county literacy program, my evenings with my ledgers, not client work anymore, just my own accounts, my own careful record of the shape of my days. I had kept a personal ledger since 1974, the year of my first client, a dry cleaning shop on Market Street owned by a man named Percival Oates, who paid me $40 a month and told everyone in town I had saved his business. The ledger was small, leather-bound, the cover gone dark with handling. I recorded everything in it in the same precise handwriting I had used for 35 years. I was not lonely exactly, but the house had more quiet in it than it used to. When Nate called in March 2 years ago to say he and Delia were thinking of relocating back, his business was expanding, the city had gotten expensive, they missed the slower pace. I felt something lift in my chest that I hadn't realized had been sitting heavy. "Come home," I said. The same words I suspect mothers have always said, in the same tone, with the same complicated hope underneath them. They arrived in April. Nate had grown into the kind of man who filled a room when he entered it. Good shoes, easy confidence, opinions delivered with the certainty of someone who had never had one seriously challenged. Delia was warm and a little distracted, the way people are when they are managing more than they let on. The first Sunday dinner was lovely. Nate grilled. Delia brought wine. They told stories about the city, and I listened and laughed and thought, this is all right. This is going to be all right. The first red flag arrived so quietly I nearly missed it entirely. Nate's business partner Roland came for dinner the following week. I had heard about Roland for years. They had built their consulting firm together from nothing. Roland handling operations, Nate handling clients, a clean division that had apparently worked well. Roland was a different kind of man than Nate, quieter. He listened before he spoke, which I have always found to be the more reliable quality. When I mentioned over dinner that I had spent 35 years in accounting. He looked at me with genuine interest and asked 3 specific intelligent questions about small business cash flow management. Nate laughed and said, "Don't get her started." It was light, affectionate in tone. I smiled and let the conversation move on, but Roland had looked at me, just briefly, just a flicker, with an expression I cataloged and set aside. Not pity, something more like recognition. I told myself Nate was simply being social, keeping the dinner moving. I told myself this was what it meant to have a son who operated at a different pace than his mother, a little impatient with the slower registers, not meaning anything by it. I set that flag down in the grass and walked past it. 3 weeks later, I came home from the literacy program on a Thursday afternoon and heard Nate's voice through the study door, warm and easy and entirely unguarded. And I stood in my own hallway in my coat, with my keys still in my hand, and I listened to my son describe me to his business partner in 11 words that told me exactly what 2 years of Sundays had not. A background person. I stood there for a moment. Then I walked quietly to the kitchen. I put the kettle on. I sat down at the table and folded my hands and waited for it to boil. And I thought about Roland's expression at that dinner table, that flicker of recognition, and I thought about the file I kept in the locked cabinet in my bedroom, the one with the documents I had never mentioned to Nate because he had never, not once, thought to ask. The kettle began to sound. I got up and made my tea. The first time I told myself it was a one-off, it was a Saturday morning in May. Nate had invited 4 of his business associates to the house for what he called a working brunch. He mentioned it to me on Friday evening, casually, the way you mention something to a person whose schedule you have stopped considering. I had already planned to have Lorraine over that Saturday, a standing arrangement we had kept for 11 years, since her husband passed, and she started needing somewhere to be on weekend mornings. I called Lorraine and rescheduled. She said it was fine. She said it in the voice she uses when something is not fine, but she loves you enough not to press it. The associates arrived at 10, 3 men and a woman, all in their 40s, all carrying the particular energy of people who had somewhere more important to be. Nate moved through the room with his easy confidence, introduction smooth, the host of everything. He introduced Delia by name. He introduced the dog, a retriever named Biscuit that Delia had brought into the marriage, by name and with a small, affectionate story. When one of the associates glanced at me in the kitchen doorway, Nate said, without breaking stride, "That's my mom. She keeps the house running." That's my mom. She keeps the house running. I went back to the kitchen. I finished preparing the food I had been asked the night before to prepare. I set it out on the table and I ate my own breakfast standing at the counter, and I told myself he was distracted. He was working. He was in a particular mode that didn't leave room for introductions to be done properly. I told myself a lot of things that year. The second scene arrived in June and was harder to rationalize. Nate had been struggling with the quarterly projections for a new contract. I knew this because I could hear him on calls in the study, his voice going tight in the way it did when numbers weren't cooperating. One evening, I knocked on the study door and offered to look at them. I said it simply. I told him I had done projections like that for 30 years, and I might be able to find what was catching. He looked at me from his desk with an expression I am going to try to describe accurately because it mattered. It was not cruel. It was the expression of a person who has been offered something by someone they genuinely do not believe is capable of providing it. A kind of gentle, almost tender dismissal, the way you decline a child's offer to help carry something heavy. "Mom," he said, "these are pretty complex. It's not really household accounting." I stood in the doorway for a moment. I thought about Percival Oates and his dry cleaning shop. I thought about the 46 businesses. I thought about the hospital system I had consulted for in 1998, whose CFO had called my analysis the most precise work he had seen from an outside firm in 20 years. "All right," I said. "Let me know if you change your mind." He didn't change his mind. 3 days later, I heard him on the phone telling someone he had found an outside consultant to sort the projections. He paid that consultant $2,000. I know because I saw the invoice on the kitchen counter, face up, unguarded. The way people leave things when they have stopped thinking about who else might read them. $2,000 for work I had offered to do at no cost, with 35 years of specific experience behind the offer. I put the invoice back exactly as I had found it and said nothing. The ledger on my nightstand felt heavier that evening, though of course it weighed exactly what it had always weighed. I opened it and ran my fingers over the columns. The first pages, the oldest ones, the entries from 1974 in the careful handwriting of a younger version of me, who had not yet proven anything to anyone and was absolutely certain she would. I needed to remember her just then. The third scene was the one my friend Lorraine witnessed, and I am still grateful she was there because I have needed the confirmation that I did not misread it. It was a dinner in July. Nate and Delia had invited several couples, neighbors, business contacts, the pleasant social architecture of people building a life in a new place. I cooked, I had offered, and Nate had accepted, with the easy generosity of someone who does not register what an offer costs the person making it. I made a standing rib roast and 3 sides and a cake that took most of the afternoon. Lorraine came early to help and stayed for dinner at my invitation. The meal was good. The conversation was lively. Somewhere in the middle of it, one of the guests, a woman named Philippa who worked in finance, asked how long I had lived in the house and what I had done professionally. Before I could answer, Nate said, "Mom was a bookkeeper, small local stuff. She's been retired for years now." He smiled at me with complete affection. "We keep her busy though, don't we, Mom?" Laughter moved around the table, comfortable, warm, including me in the joke without asking my permission to make it. Bookkeeper, small local stuff. Lorraine was sitting 2 seats away. I did not look at her. I looked at my plate, and I cut a piece of the roast I had spent the afternoon preparing, and I chewed it and swallowed it and kept my expression pleasant. After the guests left and the dishes were done, Lorraine found me on the back porch. She sat down beside me and didn't say anything for a while, which is one of the things I love most about her. Then she said, "I haven't heard you talk about your work once since they moved in." I didn't answer. "Miriam used to, you used to talk about those businesses like they were your children, every one of them. You knew every number, every story." She looked at me steadily. "When did you stop talking about that?" I thought about it honestly. "I'm not sure," I said. "That's what worries me," she said. I went to bed that night and lay in the dark and tried to locate myself, the self that had walked into 46 businesses and found the errors and fixed the books, and been called precise and thorough and invaluable. She felt far away, not gone, but far. Like a radio station, you can almost tune in if the conditions are right. I was starting to hear Nate's version of me more clearly than my own. The fourth scene happened on a Tuesday afternoon, and it crossed something I could not uncross. I had been to the county records office, a personal errand, nothing related to Nate, and I came home to find him and Roland at the kitchen table with my ledger open between them. My ledger, the leather-bound one from 1974, the one I kept on my nightstand, the one that was mine in the most private sense of the word, mine. Nate looked up when I walked in. No guilt, no apology forming, just the open, uncomplicated expression of someone who had not considered that an explanation might be required. "Roland wanted to see your old records. I told him you kept everything." He smiled. "You really do have the most organized handwriting." Roland was not smiling. Roland was looking at me with an expression I could not fully read, but that contained within it, I was certain, an apology he didn't know how to make, with Nate sitting right there. I crossed the kitchen. I picked up the ledger from the table. I held it against my chest. "Please don't take my things without asking," I said. Nate blinked. "Mom, I didn't think you'd mind." "I mind," I said. There was a brief, uncomfortable silence. Nate's expression cycled through mild surprise and then settled into the particular blankness of a person recategorizing an interaction as an overreaction. He exchanged a glance with Roland, quick, almost imperceptible. But I saw it. And Roland looked away first. That night I sat on the edge of my bed with the ledger in my lap. I opened it to the first page. Percival Oates, Market Street Dry Cleaning, January 1974. The numbers were still clean and exact after all these years, the columns still perfectly aligned. I turned to the back of the ledger, to the pocket inside the rear cover where I kept certain documents, folded small. I checked that they were still there. They were. I closed the ledger and held it and thought about Roland looking away, about what he knew that Nate didn't know he knew, about the file in the locked cabinet in my bedroom that I had not opened in 8 months. Something broke through just then, not dramatically, not with tears or anger, but with the quiet, specific clarity of an accountant who has just found the line in the ledger where everything that follows depends on everything that came before. I got up. I unlocked the cabinet. I took out the file. I sat at my desk and I began to read. The file was 11 pages. I had read it so many times over the years that I could have recited most of it from memory, but I read it again that night, slowly and completely, the way I had always read documents that mattered, not for the information, which I already had, but for the precision, for the exact weight of every word. The story of how those 11 pages came to exist begins 3 years before Nate ever joined the company. It begins with Roland. Roland Marsh had come to me in the spring of 2019, 8 months before Warren died, when I was still working 2 days a week as a consultant, and Warren was still well enough to sit on the porch in the afternoons. Roland had been referred by a former client of mine, a hardware store owner named Gus Petit, who had trusted me with his books for 20 years. Roland was trying to launch a consulting firm and needed someone who understood small business finance at the foundational level. He needed a financial architect, he said, not a bookkeeper. He said that last part looking at me carefully, as if he wanted to make certain I understood the distinction. I appreciated that. We met 4 times over 6 weeks. I reviewed his business plan, his projected cash flow, his debt structure, his contract model. It was good work, genuinely good, the kind of plan that had real bones to it. But he was undercapitalized. He needed an investor who understood the business deeply enough to be a true partner, not simply a source of funds. I made him an offer, a silent partner agreement. I would provide a capital investment in 3 tranches over 18 months, structured as convertible promissory notes. In exchange, I would hold a 22% equity stake in the firm, undisclosed in all public-facing materials, with full documentation filed privately and a formal agreement signed before a notary. Roland had an attorney review it. The attorney suggested 2 modifications. I accepted both. We signed in June of 2019. I had not told Warren, not because I was hiding it. Warren and I had no secrets in 41 years of marriage, but because he was beginning to have bad days by then, and I did not want to trouble him with something that did not yet need his attention. I planned to tell him when it bore fruit. He died before it bore fruit. And then grief took up the space where that conversation would have lived, and telling Nate seemed premature, unnecessary. The investment was performing quietly and well, and I was not a woman who announced things before they were ready to be announced. Nate joined the firm 18 months later. Roland called to tell me before it was finalized, which was courteous of him and also, I understood, a kind of check-in. He asked if I had any concerns. I said I had none as long as the documentation remained as it was. He said it would. We did not discuss it again, but Roland knew. Roland had always known, and now I understood the expression on his face at that dinner table when Nate said, "Don't get her started." Now I understood why he had looked away when Nate glanced at him over my ledger. Roland was not a dishonest man. He was a man caught between his partner's blind spot and an obligation he honored quietly and at some private cost. I put the file back in the cabinet. I did not lock it this time. I sat at my desk in the dark for a while, and I thought about what I was going to do with what I had. An accountant spends a career understanding that information is not the same as action. You can hold a number in your hand for years, and it means nothing until you place it in the right column at the right time. The time, I understood, was arriving. What I did not do was move quickly. 35 years in accounting had cured me permanently of the impulse to move quickly. I called Christine, a former colleague who had moved into contract law and whose judgment I trusted entirely, and made an appointment for the following Thursday. I drove to her office in the next town and sat across from her desk and told her the full shape of the situation. She listened without interrupting, which is the mark of a good attorney and a careful mind. She reviewed the silent partner agreement and the promissory notes. She was quiet for a moment after she finished. "These are clean," she said. "Very clean." "I drafted the initial terms myself," I said. She looked at me over her reading glasses. "Of course you did. We discussed what the documents meant in practical terms, what protections they afforded me, and what my options were." I asked 2 specific questions about the equity structure. She answered both thoroughly. I thanked her, retained her formally, and drove home through the late afternoon, feeling the way I used to feel leaving a client meeting where I had found the error. Not satisfied exactly, not yet, but aligned. Pointed in the right direction. At home, Nate was in good spirits. He had closed a new contract that day and came to dinner expansive and generous, the version of himself that I loved most. Funny and warm and fully present. Delia was laughing at something he had said. The kitchen smelled like the pasta I had made, and the evening light was coming through the window at the angle that had always made this kitchen feel like the heart of the house. I sat across from my son and watched him and felt, alongside everything else, a real and uncomplicated love for him that the rest of it had not touched. That is the complicated part of this kind of story, the one that gets left out when people tell it later. The person who diminishes you is not a stranger. They are someone whose laugh you know by heart. Tara, Nate, reached across the table and refilled my water glass without being asked and said, "Good pasta, Mom," and meant it completely. I said thank you and meant that completely too. 2 days later, I saw what Nate was truly capable of when the performance fell away entirely. Roland had come by the house to drop off some paperwork. Nate was on a call that ran long, and I made Roland coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table and talked. Genuinely talked, the way we had in those early meetings in 2019 when we were building something together and both knew it. He asked about my Thursday literacy program. I asked about his daughter's first year at university. Nate came in 20 minutes later and stopped briefly in the kitchen doorway. He looked at me and Roland at the table with our coffee cups, and he laughed, short, light, not meaning anything by it, I believe that, and said, "Look at you two. What are you even talking about? Mom doesn't know anything about the business, Roland." He was already moving toward the study when he said it. He did not see Roland's expression. He did not see mine. Roland looked at his coffee cup. A long moment. "Your mother," he said quietly to the empty doorway, to the space where Nate had been, "knows considerably more about this business than you think." He did not look at me when he said it. He said it to himself, almost. A private accounting. I put my hand briefly on the table near his. Not touching, just near. I know, I said. That was the moment I understood that Roland had been waiting for this to resolve itself for a long time, that he had been carrying the weight of what he knew and what Nate didn't know with the particular discomfort of a decent man in an indecent position. He was not going to act. That was not his role. But he was ready for someone to. That evening, I sat in the wingback chair by my bedroom window, and I held my ledger in my lap, and I thought about Percival Oates and his dry cleaning shop and the $40 monthly payment and the CFO who had called my work the most precise he had seen. I thought about the 46 businesses and the years and the columns of numbers that had told true stories about people's lives when they didn't yet know how to read them. I thought about a boy who grew up watching his mother work at a desk in a back room and concluded from the quietness of her work that nothing much was happening there. I thought about what it would mean to show him the ledger that had been running underneath his life for 3 years without his knowledge. I made one irreversible decision. I did not say it aloud. I did not need to. Outside my window, the old maple in the front yard, the one Warren had planted the year Nate was born, the one Nate had climbed as a boy and carved his initials into at 9 years old, the initials still faintly visible if you knew where to look, stood full and dark against the evening sky. It had been there 43 years. It would be there for the conversation that was coming. What happened next, they never saw coming, and neither honestly did I. By 7 in the morning on the second Friday of August, I had already showered, dressed, made my coffee, and placed the 11-page file in the center of the kitchen table with the same deliberate care I had once used setting financial statements in front of clients who were about to understand something they had not understood before. I added the ledger beside it. Not open, just present. By 7:40, I had called Christine and confirmed she was available by phone. She told me what she had told me in her office. Let the documents speak first. Give them time to read. Do not fill silence with explanation. I had been doing exactly that for 35 years and did not need the reminder, but I appreciated that she gave it anyway. It meant she understood what this morning was. By 8:15, Roland arrived. This requires explanation. I had called Roland the previous evening, the first direct call I had made to him in months. I told him simply that I was going to have a conversation with Nate this morning about the partnership agreement, and that he was welcome to be present if he chose. There was a pause on his end that lasted long enough for me to understand he had been waiting for this call for some time. What time? He said. 8:30, I said. I'll be there at 8:15, he said. He arrived exactly when he said he would, which was consistent with everything I knew about him. I poured him coffee without asking how he took it, because in 4 years of working together, I had learned black, no sugar. And he sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the file and the ledger and said nothing. His expression was the expression of a man setting down something heavy he has been carrying for a long distance. At 8:30, I went to the foot of the stairs. Nate, I called. Come down to the kitchen, please. You too, Delia. A pause. Movement overhead. Nate appeared at the top of the stairs in the easy, unhurried way of a man who has not yet recalibrated his morning. He saw Roland at the kitchen table and his expression shifted into something pleasant and slightly puzzled, the look of a person encountering a situation that doesn't yet have a category. Roland, didn't know you were coming by. He came down the stairs tucking in his shirt, Delia a few steps behind him. What's going on? Sit down, I said. Both of you, please. Delia sat immediately. She had good instincts, Delia. She felt the temperature of a room accurately even when she didn't act on what she felt. Nate sat with the relaxed posture of a man who has not yet found a reason to be otherwise. His eyes went to the file, then to the ledger, then to Roland. Roland looked back at him steadily and said nothing. I sat down. I did not open the file immediately. I looked at my son for a moment, at the face I had known for 45 years, the jaw that was Warren's jaw, the eyes that were his own, and I felt the full, complicated weight of what I was about to do, and I did it anyway, because love without honesty is not love. It is management. 3 years ago, I said, before you joined this firm, I made a financial investment in it. A formal, documented investment. I hold a 22% equity stake in the company you have been working in for 2.5 years. The kitchen was absolutely quiet. Nate looked at me. His expression had not yet found its shape. It was moving through several things at once, none of them fully formed. I opened the file. I placed the silent partner agreement in front of him. Then the 3 promissory notes, each one numbered, each one dated, each one notarized. You can read them or I can summarize, I said. Either way. He read them. It took 6 minutes. I know because the kitchen clock is loud in silence, and I counted without meaning to. Delia read over his shoulder, her hand coming to rest on the table near his arm. Roland sat with his coffee and his eyes on the middle distance. Disbelief arrived first. I watched it settle over Nate's face like a man who has been handed a document in a language he was certain he didn't speak, but is discovering, word by word, that he does. This is... He stopped. Started again. Roland, you knew about this. From the beginning, Roland said. He said it simply, without apology, the way you state a coordinate. For 2.5 years you knew my mother was a silent partner in our firm, and you didn't tell me. Your mother's agreement stipulated confidentiality at her discretion, Roland said. It was her information to share. Nate put the document down. He looked at me, and I watched the disbelief curdle into something hotter, not quite rage, but the thing that lives next door to it, the thing made of wounded pride, and the particular humiliation of a person realizing the story they have been telling about themselves has a chapter they didn't write. Why? He said. Why would you do this without telling me? Why would you invest in my company without telling me? It wasn't your company when I invested, I said. It was Roland's. You joined 18 months later. His mouth opened, closed. And I didn't tell you, I continued, because you had already made it quite clear what you thought of my professional judgment. You made it clear at dinners and in passing and through closed study doors. I said this without heat, as a fact, not an accusation. A background person, Nate, that's what you called me. The color that moved into his face then was not anger. It was something worse than anger. It was recognition. Delia made a small sound, not a word, just a sound. Then came what I had not anticipated, which was not rage and not bargaining, but something that cracked the morning open in a way none of my preparation had accounted for. Nate put his face in his hands. Not performance. I have seen performed remorse, and it looks nothing like this. This was a man in the specific physical posture of someone who has seen himself clearly for the first time in a long time and does not like the view. The pasta comment, he said into his hands. I did not know what he meant at first. 2 nights ago, good pasta, Mom. He lifted his face. His eyes were red at the rims. I said that like you were. He stopped. Like I kept the house running, I said gently. He flinched as if I had pressed on something bruised. The unexpected element, the one that completed the morning in the way I could not have scripted, came from Delia. She had been quiet through all of it. Delia was a woman who moved carefully through conflict, who calibrated her words before releasing them. But she looked at her husband now with an expression I had not seen on her before. Not angry, not vindicated, just very clear. She offered to help with the quarterly projections, Delia said. In June. Do you remember that? Nate looked at her. You told me about it that night. You said, she paused, chose the words precisely. You said it was sweet of her to offer. Sweet of her to offer. Roland stood up quietly, brought his cup to the sink, rinsed it, and placed it in the drying rack with the neat economy of a man who understands when his presence is no longer required. He looked at me once, on his way to the door, a look that said several things, none of which needed to be spoken aloud. "I'll see myself out, Constance," he said. After the door closed, Nate looked at the file for a long time. Then he looked at the ledger, still closed, still sitting on the table with its dark, worn cover, 49 years of precise handwriting inside it. "Can I see it?" he said. I slid it across the table to him. He opened it to the first page. Percival Oates, Market Street Dry Cleaning, January 1974. The numbers clean and exact and perfectly aligned. He turned pages slowly. He did not speak. He turned through the years, through businesses I had saved, and books I had untangled, and errors I had found that others had missed. Through the column of his own company's name appearing 18 months ago in my regular accounting of my own affairs, the entries precise and current and ongoing. Delia was watching him. I was watching him. The kitchen clock was loud in the silence. When he closed the ledger, he held it for a moment the way you hold something that has changed its shape in your hands. "I didn't know you," he said. It was not an excuse. It was an accounting. The specific admission of a man who has been audited and found to have been working from incorrect figures for a very long time. I reached across and took the ledger back. I held it against my chest. Outside the kitchen window, the maple Warren had planted in 1978 stood full and solid in the August morning, the initials Nate had carved into it 40 years ago still faintly visible in the bark. The house was quiet, finally quiet. But one thing still had to be faced. The first frost came early that year, thin and precise, laying itself across the front yard on a Wednesday morning in late October like a clean page. I was up before it melted. I made my coffee the way I always made it, measured, unhurried, the same ritual I had kept for 40 years, because there is a particular comfort in the repetition of small things done well, and I had stopped apologizing to myself for finding comfort there. I carried the cup to the front porch and sat in the wicker chair that had been on that porch since 1983 and watched the frost release itself from the grass in the early light, pale and quiet, and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened in the kitchen 3 months before. The maple was beginning to turn, not fully, just the outermost leaves catching first, the way change always starts at the edges before it reaches the center. The months between August and October had not been simple. I want to say that plainly, because stories like mine get tidied in the telling, and the tidying does a disservice to anyone who is living through something similar and finds the mess of it confusing. Nate did not transform overnight. He was a 45-year-old man with 45 years of accumulated habits of perception, and those do not dissolve in a single kitchen morning, no matter how clarifying that morning is. There were weeks of awkward recalibration, dinners where we were careful with each other, in the effortful way of people who are trying and know they are trying. Conversations that started well and then snagged on something old and had to be gently worked free. But he was trying. That was the thing I held on to. He was doing the unglamorous work of trying, which is the only work that actually changes anything. He asked me, in late August, to look at the quarterly projections. He set the laptop in front of me at the kitchen table and sat beside me, and did not explain the spreadsheet or simplify the language or suggest it might be complex. He just opened it and waited. I found 2 errors in 11 minutes. Neither was catastrophic. Both would have compounded quietly over 2 quarters into something that would have required real untangling. Nate looked at the screen for a long moment after I showed him. "How did you see that so fast?" he said, not rhetorical, genuinely asking. "I've been seeing things like that for 49 years, I said. "You develop a particular kind of attention." He nodded slowly. He wrote both corrections into the spreadsheet himself, and then he saved the file and closed the laptop and said without looking at me, "I wasted $2,000 in June." "You did," I said. "I'm sorry, Mom." "I know," I said. And then, because I meant it, and because it was time, "It's done, Nate." He looked up then. He had Warren's eyes, this son of mine. The same quality of attention in them when something mattered. The same slight furrow when he was working to be honest with himself. I had missed seeing that in him. I was glad to see it again. By September, he had begun introducing me differently. Not dramatically. Nate was not a man given to dramatic gestures of correction. But at a dinner with clients in early September, he said, "This is my mother, Constance Albright. She spent 35 years in accounting, and she has forgotten more about financial analysis than most people ever learn." He said it naturally, without performance, the way you say something that has simply become true for you. One of the clients asked me a question about cash flow modeling. I answered it. The conversation that followed lasted 20 minutes, and at the end of it, the client looked at Nate and said, "Your mother is remarkable." Nate said, "Yes, she is." He meant it. I could tell the difference by then. What became of the partnership agreement and its formal terms resolved itself quietly, and by mutual decision. Roland and I met for coffee in September and discussed it with the same directness we had always brought to our professional dealings. The equity stake remained as it was. Roland had never suggested otherwise, and I had never intended to relinquish it. What changed was that it became known within the firm rather than held in private. Roland told the two other senior staff members himself. Nate was present when he did it. Nobody performed surprise on Nate's behalf, and Nate didn't ask them to. I will tell you what became of Delia and Nate, because it matters, and because she deserves more than a footnote in this account. She stayed. That had not been certain through August, when the air between them was complicated in ways that had nothing to do with me, ways that had been building before the kitchen morning, and that the kitchen morning had simply made impossible to defer. They went to see someone. A counselor, 2 towns over, every Thursday at 4. Nate told me about it simply one evening, not asking for a response, just telling me the way you tell someone the true shape of your life when you have decided to stop editing it for their comfort. Delia knocked on my bedroom door one evening in late September. She sat in the chair by the window and looked at her hands for a moment, and then looked at me. "I should have said something sooner," she said. "When I saw what was happening. I saw it, and I kept thinking it wasn't my place." "It's a hard position," I said, "between a husband and his mother." "It is," she said, "but I knew better. I want you to know I knew better." I appreciated that she said it. Not because I needed the apology. I had stopped needing things from Delia some time ago, but because saying it clearly and without excessive drama was the honest thing, and she had chosen honesty at some cost to her own comfort. That deserves acknowledgement. I told her so. She nodded, and we sat together for a few minutes in the quiet of the room, and it was not uncomfortable. On a Sunday in early October, Lorraine came for our rescheduled Saturday morning, finally kept, finally uninterrupted, finally ours. We sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and talked about people we had grown up with and did not have to explain ourselves to each other, and it was exactly what it had always been, which was exactly enough. At one point, Lorraine looked around the kitchen, at the light coming through the window, at the maple beginning to turn outside, at me in my own chair, in my own house on my own morning, and she said, "There you are." Just that. There you are. I laughed. It came up easily, the way laughter does when nothing is being held back. The week before the frost, I had taken my ledger to the literacy program. One of my students, a woman of about 30 named Petra, newly arrived in the county, learning to read English with a focused determination that I found genuinely moving, had asked what it was. I showed her the first page. She traced the columns with her finger, the numbers, the name at the top. "You made this?" she said. "For 49 years," I said. She looked at it with the particular reverence of someone who understands what it means to keep a careful record of a life. "Everything is still there," she said. "Nothing is missing." "Nothing," I said. On the frost morning, I finished my coffee and went inside and climbed the stairs to my desk. I opened the ledger to the current page. I made the morning's entry in the column I kept for my own accounts. Precise, unhurried, the handwriting still the same as the first page, still the same as 1974. I noted the date. I noted the frost. I noted, in the small column I had always kept on the right side of the page, for what I privately called qualitative observations, a habit my accounting professors would have frowned upon. 2 words: still here. I closed the ledger and set it on the desk and went to the window. The maple was releasing its early turning leaves one at a time in the still morning air. Unhurried, certain of the season. Below it, barely visible in the bark on the south-facing side, the initials Nate had carved at 9 years old. N.A., small and crooked and permanent. He had climbed that tree the summer he carved them. Warren had stood below pretending not to watch, ready to catch something that didn't need catching. Some things hold. That is all I know for certain after 71 years. Some things hold. I put my hand flat on the cool window glass, and I watched the leaves fall in the October light, and I was completely, entirely, unreservedly present.